I think we have the go-ahead to kick off panel 2, which is fantastic. I hope you all enjoyed the previous session under Hugh's care, setting up this great event to such a great start. I'm Sonya Lennon, and welcome to panel 2 of the Future of Media Experience, Models and Practice. So in this session, we're going to explore the current model and its appropriateness for the future. We look at this theme today specifically as an Irish issue, but with a global perspective, looking at universal themes and lessons already learnt within today's media landscape. And we have a phenomenal panel of speakers to share their wisdoms in this. It gives us really a fantastic opportunity to follow on from the previous discussion and to start imagining a better future for our media in terms of its construction, the model itself, and every aspect of it. If we look at the current media, and it's funny because this theme was echoed in some of the previous speakers' contributions, it's a little bit like a tiny old cottage that has had multiple extensions tacked on as needed. And now I think it's a great opportunity for us to stand back and critically look at what we've built and ask whether it is at this stage fit for purpose. We will be integrating your questions through the Q&A function after the panelists' remarks. So please don't share them in the chat function. I won't get to see them. So put your questions in the Q&A and we will integrate as many as possible because as our audience, you're a huge part of this discussion and we would like you to be heard. Our first speaker is Áine Kerr, who is the COO of Kinzen. She is a risk taker, a trailblazer. She has been lauded both academically and professionally for her significant body of work and her impact. Áine will be speaking to us from the perspective of new media technology and new business modelling, focusing on issues of trust and disinformation, which have already been teed up, I suppose, the role of the new business model in the problem, and visioning a future for our media. Áine.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Sonya. Yeah, just to set a little bit of context on how have we gotten to this moment, and to step back and maybe step onto the balcony. We find ourselves, to state the obvious, in the middle of a global pandemic, but also a global infodemic. These two things are playing out side by side. So we're fighting the COVID-19 virus, but also the virus that is misinformation and disinformation. And this whole information crisis, it didn't have its beginnings, in November 2016, or it didn't just reach its breaking point on January 6th with the US Capitol riots. This whole information disorder, it's been simmering for decades, especially in the midst of the move fast and break things era, when algorithms were built to keep us endlessly scrolling. I worry I'm going to have arthritis in my thumb in years to come, where we're scrolling for hours through just streams of content designed for those dopamine hits, but constantly has us going back, breathlessly checking for likes and comments. And all the while, to the backdrop of that, we're fueling ad dollars. So really, over recent decades, we've seen an entire industry being built for speed, for clicks, for scale, more content everywhere. But in the process of that whole movement of move fast and break things, when everyone became a publisher, we can all publish to the internet, take out our smartphones today, text, video, images. We've really gone through huge modes of disruption. We can all distribute content, we consume it vastly. We no longer have appointed viewing times with the news in the way even my generation did growing up. And in all of that, we broke the connection between people and quality news and information. And that's a really important point to emphasize in terms of all of those years of disruption. And in all of that, we've of course seen some news outlets that have survived. They've built new business models through advertising, through subscriptions, memberships, paywalls. But of course, some people who don't have the propensity to pay for quality news and information have been left behind with the free, clickbait, and often very divisive content. We also know, in parallel to that, that we've had news outlets world over didn't survive these years of disruption that move fast and break things. You look to the United States, a quarter of all of our newspapers have gone out of business in the last 15 years. That's creating these so-called news deserts that's left something like 1,800 communities now without a local news outlet. Like, what does that mean for those 1,800 communities now without a local newspaper, a local institution, a local publisher, a local broadcaster? And I think back to this whole phenomenon of disinformation, this whole moment of disruption, even in 2010, at the beginnings of Storyful, here in Dublin, the first social media verification agency. As much as we were going out as the internet's kind of first fact checkers and verifying content to be true and trustworthy and bringing it from the margins to the mainstream, we were also spending so much of our time back in 2010 debunking. We had a daily hashtag, daily debunk, because you had constantly pranksters inserting themselves into these new moments, trying to dupe people with photoshops and stage videos. But equally, you had military regimes world over trying to use these moments for their own propaganda, recycling old materials from other locations and timelines. And so in all of this moment, we have mistrust, we have manipulation, we have a sense of overload, we have this broken connection. And what all of that has done is, in this moment, create a wicked problem. In this perfect storm of a global pandemic and a global infodemic, that this wicked problem of a collapse in trust, when we have more clickbait, sometimes fewer newsrooms, and more organized campaigns of deception that can actually do real world harm. And unfortunately, in this moment of a real wicked problem, by its very definition, it's complex, it's incomplete, it's contradictory, it's constantly changing, and there's no one solution when it comes to this big question of the model and how do we ensure that we're amplifying quality and mitigating the bad. Like, I live every day now here in my spare room in the global pandemic, dealing in the world of disinformation. And I see how campaigns every day start on the anonymous web. So take your 4chans, your Discords, move into closed, semi-closed groups like your Twitter DMs, your Facebooks, your WhatsApp groups, onto conspiracy communities like Reddit, YouTube channels, and then out into the open social networks like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, where our quality news providers are competing for attention. And we see in these moments of upheavals, be it election fallouts or COVID-19, people, we all generate these different levels of high uncertainty, which in turn breeds this anxiety. And what do humans do when we're trying to resolve uncertainty and anxiety? We seek out information about the threat. But the problem right now, in this moment when our anxiety is heightened, some people are looking for information in the wrong place. And that's why we've probably all had that moment in our WhatsApp group where the uncle or the aunt comes in with the, I've heard from a friend who's heard from a friend who says, and we know in that moment, misinformation, they're being used to spread false news. And so as we grapple with this wicked problem today, knowing that quality news and information is critical to how we understand the world around us, we need to step back, and hopefully today's forum is helpful to that, to ask some hard questions about the model underpinning our news and information systems. So what is the role of governments, our schools, our librarians, our academics, our technology companies in helping create, let's say, news literacy programs so that we are all developing as critical thinkers and engaged news consumers? What's the role of platforms, let's say, when it comes to ensuring that the information diet we consume every day is healthy, it's informative, meaningful, relevant, trustworthy? How do we ensure every day through all of these news and information experiences that we're elevating the quality and mitigating the bad, particularly the disinformation, the stuff that can do real world harm? And what parts of the model, particularly advertising, do we accept is now broken? How do we move from experiences that are about that endless scroll, that is about keeping you there as long as possible once you're consuming more and more content, instead to a concept like time well spent, as Tristan Harris has talked about? And how do we as journalists think more about the demand, the need for our journalism? How is our journalism relevant in people's everyday lives rather than just the supply of our journalism and our stories? So how do we get better at amplifying the why journalism matters in people's everyday lives? So I'll conclude by saying we accept that we will need a vaccine to protect us against the pandemic, the deadly virus that is COVID-19. The question also now is, how are we going to inoculate ourselves against an information disorder and equip ourselves with a really constant, consistent supply of quality news and information. And that starts with really starting to accept that some of the model underpinning all of this is broken.
Thanks, Áine. I could dive in there and ask you a million questions, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to move through your fellow panelists, and we'll come back to a more discursive element then at the end. I'd like to introduce Kevin Rafter, who is Professor of Political Communications in DCU. He is chair of both the Arts Council and the Compliance Committee of the Broadcast Association of Ireland. He's an author and a journalist, and Kevin will be reflecting on reimagining the value of public service broadcasting with a spotlight on key decision-making, legislative decision-making, political imperative, and designing the future model. Kevin.
Thank you, Sonya. Good afternoon, everybody. We're frequently told that the model for funding model for media organizations is broken. I think, however, it's more appropriate to say that the model has changed. In the past, dealing with finances was relatively straightforward. For RTE, there was the licensing and advertising, and for everyone else, there was advertising and cover price income. Now, to be viable, media organizations, from public broadcasters to digital startups, need to have multiple revenue sources. The response of policymakers at national and EU level to the changed media funding landscape has been slow, pedestrian even. I left journalism in 2008, so I'm a former journalist, but in the intervening years, I've listened to and I've participated in debates, discussions, consultations on the future of the media. In an Irish context, the Future of Media Commission is the latest entity. So when it comes to the media, we keep talking about the future. And a cynic might say that's a strategy to avoid taking and making decisions today. In terms of the funding model, the current model and the appropriateness for the future, which is our theme for this panel, the immediate options are actually very clear. Recast the license fee to offer public broadcasters like RTE greater financial certainty on that strand of their income. Use more of the recast license fee pot to support public service media beyond RTE, specifically in relation to their news and current affairs programming, and assist other media organisations by means of the levies that we heard about in the previous session, by means of VAT reform, and tackling the revenue stripping behaviour of Facebook and Google. The provision of balanced, impartial, well-resourced and independent public broadcast services is fundamental to our democracy. With three operational public broadcasters defined in law, TG Car, RTE and Oireachtas TV, and I'll confine my remarks to RTE, which needs support, but also needs to deliver a return for such support. Telefishéireann first broadcast on New Year's Eve 1961, and that decade commenced an era of great change in Irish society. At the time, the Catholic Church, Fianna Fáil and the GAA could have been considered national institutions. And that triumvirate was joined by the soon-to-be renamed Radio Telefishéireann, a position that RTE held more often than not proudly for over 3 decades. But the media landscape, and I suppose more correctly, the broadcast landscape in Ireland changed fundamentally with deregulation of the radio and television market in the late 1980s. And over the following decade, privately owned radio stations, and eventually joined by TV3 in 1998, they were embraced by the Irish audience. And these broadcasters threw down a real challenge to RTE's ownership of the national conversation. 10 years ago, the then Director General of RTE spoke about a typical day consuming various forms of news content, media content, a day when you didn't use any of RTE's services. Such was the then transformed national media landscape, and one where global media conglomerates had ready access to the Irish audience. A decade later, RTE's dominance has been even further reduced. Yet despite all of the content that's available to us, we still need Irish stories told. We need places for local and national debates that are focused on our culture, our history, our identity, our diversities. And we need programming that considers an Irish perspective on the outside world. We need investigative journalism, coverage of arts and culture, and unique programming for children and young people. Other media, and I'll come back to this point in a moment, other media now helps to deliver public service broadcasting. But a national broadcaster like RTE remains at the core of broadcasting services in Ireland. In delivering, and I suppose what we want from RTE and from public service media, RTE has to be challenged and it has to be different and distinctive from its national and international rivals. We need RTE in place to set standards, not just in editorial programming, but also how it treats its staff, how it ensures viable and rewarding and decently paid careers. RTE standards should be industry benchmarks. But we need to be honest, this is all going to be achieved with a leaner, smaller organisation. RTE has to decide what type of broadcaster it wants to be. The status quo or continuing to chip away at current output is not a strategy. In considering the funding model for RTE, we first need the broadcaster to put its own house in order. Living on a deficit is not sustainable, nor is the belief that a licence fee increase will solve all the station's current and future challenges. It won't. Nevertheless, the licence fee system needs immediate action. Now, in truth, it's needed immediate action for over a decade now. The current arrangement's not fit for purpose. We have a high rate of invasion. Technology continues to change viewing habits, and how we access all media and not public's. It's not just public service media has changed fundamentally. But we don't need more debate. We need a decision from the range of policy options that are available. We know we can't sustain a BBC type model with 100% licence fee. It's just a matter of scale. But the dual funding system can still be relevant if we recast the licence fee model. Back in 2011, the idea of moving to a household charge was proposed, but not progressed. There are alternative regimes in place in other EU countries, Greece, Italy, Portugal, Finland, France. They offer us ready-made options. We need to decide what model we want for Ireland, and then the outcome that model must deliver. A more efficient collection system and an increase in the overall pot of money available to fund RTE and other media organisations. I worked for RTE as a broadcaster, as a reporter, as a producer and a presenter. So I value and I recognise the value of the organisation as a national broadcaster. But equally, I see the value of other local and national broadcast services, which attract a significant number of the Irish audience every day. We need new legislation to recognise and support public service programming on these stations. Part of the current licence fee system supports programming on non-RTE broadcast stations through the Sound and Vision Fund. This funding arrangement should be extended, particularly to support the provision of local news and current affairs programming on privately owned broadcast services. We need deeper coverage of local council meetings, court sittings, among the other important contributions that the media can make to our democracy. So funding non-RTE public service journalism from a recast licence fee system makes sense. But this must be an ongoing funding commitment to support real jobs and sustained reporting, not an ad hoc annual application scheme. Finally, turning to other media organisations, national and regional newspapers, digital news outlets, they're also under financial pressure, and there are ready-made policy options available to offer them greater financial stability. Now, there are issues about giving local and national newspapers and other privately owned digital providers access to a licence fee types income. It's problematic for reasons to do with their profit orientation and regulation. RTE and the privately owned licensed broadcasters have defined statutory responsibilities, and they operate within a legislative regulatory environment that's separate from the self-regulatory regime that covers the print media and some digital outlets. So, we need to consider that, but notwithstanding reservations about offering direct subvention to those companies, policymakers shouldn't delay any further about giving them greater financial stability. And there are a few steps that can be taken immediately. The government should deal with the current VAT regime by introducing a zero rate of VAT and ending the different VAT rates on print and digital newspapers, currently 8% and 23% respectively. Separately, and I feel very strongly about this, the government working within a European context needs to support a system to force big tech companies to pay news providers for their content in a manner similar to the Australian government earlier this year. The digital barons who own Google and Facebook, they've siphoned revenue from the media sector. That revenue stream needs to be returned. So in summary, the ball on the funding model is already with those who make policy. They now need to play that ball to deliver a sustainable system for our media sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. We are getting some questions in at the moment, which we will be coming to shortly. Please do put your questions into the Q&A function and we will come to them after our final panellist. Our final panelist is Roberto Suárez Candel, and he is the head of strategy and media intelligence. He was, excuse me, until 2020, the head of strategy media intelligence for the European Broadcasting Union, just before he set up his own consultancy. He has a PhD in social communications, has advised obviously at European level within the sector, and he really brings, I suppose, today's panel an international perspective. Roberto is going to be touching on the role of public service broadcasting being more than about the money, political and cultural and economical issues that need to be addressed and defined, and really looking at what the true ROI of public service broadcasting is. Roberto.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for the introduction. Well, when preparing my contribution to this and listening to the previous statements, I very much agree with Kevin. So many debates about this, so many times discussing the same thing. And I think it's time for action. But this is nothing new. I guess many people before me have said this is time for action. If we think about the model of public service broadcasting in the current context of confusion, in the previous panel someone was saying, I'm confused about the future because of the increasing complexity, I would say, building my opinion in my 8 years of experience at the EBU and having visited so many countries across Europe, the model is outdated. But the model is outdated not because public service media is not needed or relevant. The model is not outdated because the people working there are not delivering good content and good product. The model is outdated because it's not changing at the speed that society, technology, markets are changing. And what I have seen across all Europe is public service media organizations just catching up. And I would say the following: having public service media is an option. It's a choice you need to make. It's a choice that is a political choice, it's a cultural choice, it's an industrial choice, it's a societal choice. And it's not right or wrong to have public service media. But I think that we are not making the smart choices. And politicians are not making the smart choices because they are not talking about the real things that are at stake, the real impact that choosing going in one direction or another will happen. So today, I would like to say, yes, this debate is never ending, and about funding and the model of public service. My question is, why is it never ending? And I think it's because we are focusing on the wrong issues to talk about. We are talking about money. But we know that there is money. In this life, there is money for things that are important, for things that are relevant. So my point is that if we are finding difficulties to find money for public service media, it is maybe because we are not clear about the value it has. We are not talking about the right topics to make that choice, that smart choice that I was pointing before. And I think this is because we don't know why, the question is why we need public service media and why public service media should be there. And this why is nothing that we should discuss at a parliamentary committee or at a university. Of course, we need to discuss it there, but the answer needs to come from the common people at the street. The common people at the street need to understand that why. And if we don't help them to understand that why, there is no future at all. It is sad to say, but there is no future at all for these organizations that are just catching up with the speed of the market, the speed of technology. So today I would like to propose 3 topics to think about to make this a smart choice. The first thing is that we need to change the narrative and the conceptualization of public service from public service media being a cost, expense that the country needs to make, into an investment. And to do that, we need a new narrative. And the narrative needs to be thinking in public service media not as a content provider. Anybody can be a content provider in this world of multiple technologies and platforms. What public service media needs to be is a value provider. And to become a value provider means to understand the the problems and the needs of the people, and how you can use your content producing, your journalistic skills to provide, yes, content and services, audiovisual content and audiovisual services that solve those problems. But again, this is not about we are journalists, content providers, content producers, and here you have the content, do something with the content, consume it. No, this is about I'm going to look at my people, the people I'm serving. I'm going to find out what keeps them awake in the night, what the problems are, and I'm going to use my skills as a public servant to provide solutions or to contribute to provide to these solutions. If we think in these ways, we are challenging the business model of public service media. Because yes, public service media has a business model. People will say, no, it's not for profit. And no, but there's a business model. If we bring someone that doesn't understand about public service and we ask this person, let's figure out where the money comes from, why the results are, how the results are measured, how decisions are made. I'm sorry to say, but today, public service media's business model is about bringing market share to politicians. That's the business model. You don't have market share, you are irrelevant, we're going to cut your funding. Of course, in a world where market share is decreasing without any solution because of multiple channels, we know that, this currency is going to kill public service. Of course, media managers, public service media managers are very much reluctant to make changes because if I lose my audience, my politicians are going to criticize me and they're going to cut. Yes, well, we need a radical change. We need to start measuring impact. What do people think about your content? What are the consequences of having that content? That requires much more investment in research and understanding more than a market share. Does market share mean anything to the people in the street? Is there a reason for them to accept to pay taxes for public service? No. They will be happy to pay taxes for public service if the content they see there is valid for the children. If teenagers maybe can deal with the problems of teenagers being teenagers through that content. If you as an adult can be well informed about the situation in your country and not with this content that Áine was mentioning before, like it's making our heads crazy. So how do we move from a business model focused on delivering market share into a business model of delivering value and impact for the society? This is going to have a very strong impact also on the willingness to pay. Because yes, we need to investigate why do the citizens want or not want to pay directly or indirectly for the public service media. So we need to address the concept of value for money. And public broadcasters all over Europe have been very reluctant to address this question because they feel that their business is not about money. Well, yes, it is. You need the money to do the great content that you want to do. You need the taxes that people pay. So they need more research, more investigation about that willingness to pay and how this is built. Actually, in a research done in Austria, it was discovered that those individuals with highest amount of devices that are connected to online, with a higher consumption of multiple platforms, and actually being white and male and young, were more likely to pay for public service because they saw that it was a complement in their very diverse diets. But they didn't want to pay all what they are supposed to pay. They wanted to pay less. And when asked about the criteria, what's your reference to define how much you want to pay for this? They said Netflix. So we need to investigate how people think. Again, public service is not about a bunch of great content producers and journalists pushing content to the people. It's about great content producers and journalists understanding people's needs and using their skills to bring solutions. And finally, I wanted to add that, and this has been mentioned in the panel before, and Kevin has also made reference to that, we need public service to be the driver, to be a very important cornerstone of your national media industry. We need a company that has other values and other objectives beyond economic profitability to be able to take that investment that the government, that the public is doing, and to redistribute that in the territory in the different companies, in content that, yes, is not economically profitable, but it's going to be democratically profitable, societally profitable, culturally profitable. So for me, to close my contribution, there is money. Governments have money, people have money, but they want to choose how they use their money. And I'm afraid that across Europe, even if they are investing enormous efforts and they have their best intention, public broadcasters are not being successful in articulating a narrative. And with this, I don't mean just communication campaigns. It's also an internal narrative, because when you change your objectives as a company and you focus on impact, that's going to change the way you produce, the way you distribute, the way you articulate your corporate strategy. So I would say my advice, my recipes for creating this future model for public service is, let's just start from zero. I know that's difficult. And let's write in a paper why. What's the value we bring to society? What are the services that we need to provide that value? And how are we becoming something in society for the industry, for the democratic system, for the culture? How do we become, for all these stakeholders, for all these sectors and industries, how do we become, in the information society and with the professionals that we have, how do we become a driver for our country? If we articulate that as a narrative, as a strategy, the money will come along, because people will want to invest into that. I know this, that I'm saying it's very difficult. There are many organizations that are initiating the journey in this transformation. My experience, what I have seen is that the transformation occurs successfully when two things happen. When you have brave leaders in public service media that make decisions, yes, I'm cutting money from my flagship channel and I'm pushing this to the digital. Yes, I'm losing market share, but I'm increasing my impact. And this also happens when the political establishments makes a commitment, makes a decision, and afterwards a commitment. We are going to leave the professionals alone. We are going to ask them to be accountable, of course, but let them alone, together with experts, together with the EBU, together with people, advisors that can help them to get all this knowledge that they need. Let them craft a good plan. And then let's make public service not a political choice, but a smart choice that is about the democracy, the culture, the industry that we want, in the end, about the country that we want.
Thank you so much, Roberto. Fascinating from all our panelists, and so many pertinent topics covered there around key issues around trust and who we want to be as a country and what it's really going to take in real terms to make that happen. Áine, I'd love to come to you. You spoke about trust and disinformation and the infodemic, and these are very real and universal issues. I'm wondering what role our respect for the audience plays in this, in that, you know, the audience are our society, are our culture, and do we need to reimagine that relationship?
Yeah, between journalist and audience, absolutely, where it becomes, you know, public service journalism, and that we are building, I think, from the outside in with people, our readers, our viewers in mind. And so what does that look like? Well, I think you're starting to see lots of really interesting examples in the UK. You've got Tortoise Media, which is more about slow news and about giving people a diet of news that might just be 5 articles in the day to help them feel smarter and informed about the world around them. You look across to the United States, where you've got Herkin Media, which is trying to build technology that helps ensure that you are listening and representing your communities, again, back to the idea of outside in. So it's actually people powered. And in that concept of really thinking about our audiences and the relationships with them, that if we start to think not about that time spent and how do we keep them there for as long as possible, consuming more and more content and therefore more and more advertising, what does it look like if it is that time well spent in maybe slow news? So it's not simply about open rates and click-throughs, but more the strength of engagement, building loyalty with your audience to make sure that they're coming back all the time because they see themselves represented in the news and information they're consuming, which does require us, which I think your last panel was talking about, which was diversity. How do we make sure our newsrooms look and feel like the communities that we serve? And I think in all of that, we have to design for our audiences with trust and with transparency in mind, that we're all the time optimizing for trust. And I think if we're to do that, while the platforms have clearly made mistakes and failed to at times understand the unintended consequences of their algorithms and recommenders, what they did do well, and which I think publishers and journalists can learn from in terms of really building this connection again with audiences, is to be obsessive about understanding your users, building that deep engagement, building that connection, but doing it in new ways, thinking about the rhythm of people's days, so that if I'm commuting into work on my bike, I'm going to want maybe 30 minutes of very personalized, curated audio news versus somebody who's maybe going to take the Dart to work today and they want a downloadable newsletter. And so we have to start thinking about the variety of contexts that our audience find themselves in and make sure that we are building formats to fit different needs, underpinned all the time, as I say, with that trust and transparency and that commitment to real people-powered journalism from the outside in.
Thank you so much. We have a question in here from Mark Harrington, who says, really enjoying the discussion. Wonder if the panel have any views on funding models that some online news outlets are exploring, crowdfunding, investigative journalism, micropayments, etc. So, I mean, we are looking at remodeling, and would anybody like to take that question? So new models of funding through crowdfunding or micropayments.
I think in terms of, just if I can just jump in briefly, Sonya, and like, you know, Áine's living this, but in terms of as a digital startup, but we need multiple revenue sources, and we need to open those up to media organizations, the big organizations and the new kids on the block. So if people are prepared to fund through their own pockets types of journalism, that's, you know, all very well. But I do think in terms of, we need to be careful in terms of, we need sustained journalism. We need journalism that provides careers. One of the biggest challenges that we face alongside diversity in Irish journalism is the hollowing out of the profession. The number of experienced journalists who leave, and that is a real challenge. So we need sustained careers, well-paid jobs, and organizations that can do that. But that doesn't mean in this new media landscape we will have multiple sources and organizations getting revenue from a variety of different places, whereas previously it was advertising and subscription. The people that, you know, you bought your newspaper, you got revenue, you took an ad in a newspaper, revenue came in. Now it's going to be multiple sources, and we're going to have a variety of different outlets, and that is healthy. But we need to remember that we need sustained careers. We need people to actually stay in journalism, and to do that, you have to be able to pay salaries.
And to follow on from that, Kevin, I mean, I think that, you know, Larry spoke about, you know, the spectre of stakeholder and this pull of FDI, in the same way that there's a pull of, you know, very, very strong salaries in the private sector, maybe away from journalism towards the multinationals. What do we do at a legislative level to mitigate against that?
Well, I made reference to the discussions that went on between the big tech companies in Australia earlier this year. And I know there are discussions on between Irish media companies and Google and Facebook at the moment in relation to returning some of the money that the big tech companies get through advertising and through the content of media companies. That certainly is something where I think the government could give it a good push, and I think it should certainly embrace those discussions and possibly maybe put them on a more formalized footing in terms of that there is revenue coming back, because these are huge companies. Like in 20 years ago, people were concerned about Rupert Murdoch and Dennis O'Brien. They are dwarfed by Facebook and Google. These companies have huge revenue sources. So I think the government, what they could do is actually put in place structures to allow some of that money to come back into the Irish media sector.
Thank you. Roberta, there was a bit of conversation in the previous panel around platforming and I suppose redefining what public service media is. And I would see, you know, for example, what Áine is doing at Kinzen as public service media, just it doesn't fit into the model that we've created. So how could we look at that? I mean, I think of, and Áine, you probably are aware of Audrey Tang and the work that's being done in Taiwan through your knowledge of Tristan Harris, where you know they are taking the public as a major component of output, and they're listening to their people. You know, what could that look like, and what do we scrape into this model?
Well, when you want to become an organization that is driven by the purpose of solving people's problems, fulfilling people's needs, and I take the opportunity to answer to Andrew Campbell, who has put there, well, isn't that just giving to the people what they want? So this is going to bring quality down? Not at all, because I'm not talking about giving people what they click on. No. What I'm talking is about understanding society, doing research, investigating what the problems are. Do we have a problem about eating disorders in teenagers? Do we have a problem about loneliness of aged people? What are the problems that we have? And then how do we make decisions that are not driven by economic profitability to push content, media solutions that contribute to solve that? Then I think that applying the platform concept to public service media is an absolutely necessary step. Public service media is no longer capable of producing everything they need. And we want to stimulate the industry. And it's not only about the audiovisual industry. There are plenty of other cultural and creative industries that have content that needs to be pushed to the people. So setting as an objective for these public broadcasters to become a platform that engages its own resources in investigating society. Not that they need to do it themselves. There are plenty of university scholars investigating society and research institutes, obtaining that information, and then using technology to connect people's problems, people's needs with content providers, and whether it's produced in-house or it's outsourced, and then using technology and using a new approach to distribution to maximize the effectiveness and efficiency of pushing that content, making that content reach to the right people. If we do that, connecting to what I said before, then we will no longer be talking about market share, because we are moving from being a broadcaster, which, well, it's legitimate, but we're talking about the future, to become a media organization, an institution in society that is connecting people and content to solve problems. So again, this is not about this populist approach of saying, just let's give people whatever they want. And no, this is not about that. This is about understanding society and then using technology, updating the mindset in the public service media organizations, and helping them to become a platform. I'm not saying this is easy. I understand. We have organizations that have been there for decades with a structure, and we have public workers. It's very difficult. Sometimes I even think that it would be easier to stop and start from the beginning, but that's not very popular. So I will not suggest that.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah, no, but we don't need that. What we need, as I said before, brave leaders and autonomy, because we are wasting so much energy and effort because of this political interference that is not helping people to make a smart choice, as I said before.
Thank you. And you know, really, when we look at it in those terms, Kevin, we see how important community has become throughout COVID, and how much that sense of belonging has a huge importance. We have an opportunity then, if we look at a platform approach, of really diving into, you know, very localized, sort of a trickle down of sort of fit for purpose media, depending on the communities that we serve. Do you see that as something that could happen?
Yeah, and I think that possibly what we need to do is to foster and encourage greater partnerships, particularly between the established media organizations. So say we were going to have a recast license fee and RT is going to get an injection of money. Well, part of that should come with defined criteria to say we need you to do X, Y, and Z. And part of that is, you know, is going to be partnerships with local media. There's no reason why we can't see, you know, the Irish Times or RTE working with local media in terms of providing local news services. Are working with digital startups to say, look, you know what, we want to provide content and to generate content about our councils, about our courts in our communities. RT is a national infrastructure, so is the Irish Times. So maybe part of it is actually saying to them, you know what, we're going to lay it down to you in terms of providing local content, working with local news providers, existing local newspapers, digital startups. That's all part of the background. But to get there, we need to make some of the fundamental decisions about how we fund our media. And as I say, I find this whole debate very frustrating because it's not rocket science. There are immediate decisions that have to be taken. And if we take those, then we can have all the other conversations about diversity and about the role of the media and literacy, because actually there'll be a bigger pot of cash available. It's not a huge amount of money that we're playing with, but to give the national media organizations, which are still the big players in the block, to give them financial stability, and then to set them loose in terms of saying, as part of this, we want you to do A, B, and C around the country the way you describe.
Yeah, and they are the big players in one sense, but they're not in another. And a question has come in for Áine. How can we stop and prevent these protagonists spread disinformation when technology makes it so easy for them to create content? And what can be done, really? I mean, and this is an area that you're so familiar with. What are the actions?
Yeah, it's a great question. Like, I think one of our starting principles here when it comes to the algorithms, the recommenders that underpin all of our consumption of news and information, is to radically rebuild, but with, you know, trust and transparency in mind. And 3 quick points. I would say when it comes to disinformation specifically, automation is not going to be the answer. Like, there has been some analysis, you know, that AI is like a Swiss Army knife for all of these wicked problems. But when it comes to disinformation and misinformation, you're going to hear a lot more in the future about human in the loop, or this concept of trusted flaggers. And it's something we profoundly believe in Kinzen, that yes, you're going to need artificial intelligence that's helping you understand the patterns and map them, you know, where you're taking topics and actors over here and new dog whistles and constantly trying to understand the shape of all of these campaigns that are sowing the mistrust globally. But you are going to need humans inputting into that machine, and you're going to need humans on the other side. So the key piece in all of this is to realize automation is not going to be the panacea here. We are going to need humans in the loop, expert journalists, researchers, fact checkers that are making sense of this entire ecosystem and inputting it into our machines and our algorithms and recommenders. So that's 1. 2, in all of this, in terms of, how do we get to grips with it? If we are getting better at detecting and disrupting this, and therefore better understanding the dog whistles, the narratives, and the platforms can take action because of the human in the loops and the trusted flaggers, yes, there's probably going to be need for regulation. And we've obviously seen in the United States, Section 230 is under review. We've obviously seen in the European Union, the Digital Services Act, and a lot of thinking there. And there's a lot of good models, case studies, examples. But what I will say is that that needs to be informed by experts. I don't think we want to see government regulation world over coming in here. What we need to really think about is, how do we regulate where we are starting to limit freedom of reach rather than freedom of speech. And to do that informed by experts who understand this entire ecosystem and regulate and have accountability, where platforms, the public, citizens, publishers, everybody is buying into a covenant of understanding. And the third thing to say as well is that how do we get ahead of this? Is that we need moderation for the citizen, by the citizen. Like, unfortunately, this entire dynamic is probably going to get worse before it gets better. We can solve for it, yes, through better artificial technologies, that human in the loop. Yes, we're going to need better oversight and regulation. Yes, we're going to need the news literacy pieces. But in order for this to scale, we are going to need our communities, all of us working collectively to flag, disrupt, and build that ecosystem where the community at large is crowdsourcing and helping ensuring that the good rises to the top and the bad is ultimately being mitigated.
Fascinating and so wonderful to talk to you today, and thank you to those who submitted questions as well. It was wonderful to hear your thoughts and that you enjoyed the panel. You know, in review, we're really looking at a situation where we have an opportunity, and you know, we braked into the pandemic. We can accelerate out and make real change, because we're kind of used to fast change now, but it will require really strong political leadership. I think it can't happen without that. But I think the opportunity in reshaping what our public service media looks like, and really creating it for the country that we want to live in and the people that we want to live in it is a massive opportunity that we should be looking to now. Roberto, Kevin and Áine, thank you so much for taking part today. Your insights were so valuable to everybody, and I would say bear a few moments before panel 3 is launched. Thank you so much.